Hello. Um, so originally I was gonna do this in the same way as the last video I made, on Isidro, where I just kind of read the script out and made like a little video essay type thing, and I have the whole script, but I wrote it like such a long time ago, and then I had like exams and a bunch of other stuff, so it's just taken me like forever to get around to recording it. So at this point I can't actually remember what's in the script, so instead of reading it like matter-of-factly, I'm just gonna kind of casually read it to myself and try and turn that into a video instead. And we'll see how that goes. If I like it, I'll probably do it for the other Berserk character analysis that I'm planning on writing. I've started the Serpico one sort of, but that's it. So yeah, this is the second video in a series of potentially 10 Berserk character analysis type videos. I'll just go through them, all the characters one by one. Well, not all in separate videos, some of them will be combined. Last time I talked about Isidro and how his character is kind of representative of the role of play and imagination in basically making sure children aren't like traumatized, I guess. This time I'm going to talk about Serpico, who I think is more... he's definitely more like multifaceted. He has more themes going for him. So yeah, there's more to talk about, but also none of the themes are sort of as singularly important as the idea behind Isidro, so I don't know. So Serpico, like a lot of other characters in Berserk, Miura loves to do this with a lot of his characters, and that's to take the childhood of that character and use it to almost completely inform how that character thinks and acts as an adult. And with Serpico, we see that in a two-part chapter called Of Snow and Flame, which I think must be about chapter 100 and 150, somewhere around there. Right after the kind of rebirth of Griffith and everything happens, we get a two-part flashback, which is primarily from the perspective of Serpico, which is showing both his and Farnice's childhood, but in this case obviously we're only going to be focusing, or we're mostly going to be focusing on Serpico. So Serpico, he very much is a victim throughout his childhood, not in like a more subtle way, like at all, like it's very blatant. He's consistently manipulated, he's abused, and he faces a lot of classism because he was born a peasant. He's a bastard child of Federico Vermilion, who's also Farnice's father, and Federico uses that sort of precise position of power to manipulate him into being Farnice's sort of attendant, which is essentially a way of making it so that instead of a member of the aristocracy having to be around Farnice, who is obviously mentally disturbed, sort of, you know, a peasant has to do it instead. And of course, Farnice herself, as much as she is a victim, she also emotionally and physically abuses Serpico all the way through to being young adults. And we see this in Of Snow and Flame, when he is flogged after purposefully throwing a duel he had against an aristocrat, which is already a sign of how his character is born from that childhood experience. And he's like completely emotionless during the scene up until when she decides to actually bite him, which is just like really weird. Obviously you would react to that, but the fact that he's not even reacting to being beaten is pretty obviously a sign that this is a regular occurrence for him. He's regularly physically abused. He doesn't see anything wrong with it. I think partly that's because he has kind of an internalized classism. much more than basically like every other character who isn't in the nobility. He thinks that he is lesser because of his peasant birth, even if he's half noble, I guess. And this all culminates in him being forced to execute his own mother, who has gone kind of crazy. I think she must have dementia or something along those lines at this point, so she doesn't actually recognize him, I don't think. I can't really remember. I'm pretty sure she doesn't. But obviously he recognizes her, and he shows sympathy for her. He doesn't want to like burn her at the stake, which is what's supposed to happen to her. But Farnese forces him to do it because she senses that kind of moment of weakness. And this is obviously like a super cruel moment, and it's just kind of the high point of all of the abuse Serpico has faced throughout his upbringing. But simultaneously it functions as a moment of kind of isolating Serpico from his humanity, and turning him into like a truly loyal servant. Like, he'll do anything Farnese asks of him now, because he literally killed a member of his family, somebody who deeply cared for her, and that's obviously a product of the emotional abuse that he faced as a child. So what we can take from this is obviously this message that these kind of abuses can make people dependent on the abuser. That's definitely a thing that happens. And Serpico is just like a prime example of that in fiction, I would say. The result of this childhood of emotional and physical abuse, for Serpico, there's 3 key personality traits that are born from this. Well, there are actually 4, sorry, but 3 of them aren't things that are changed as a part of the main character arc he undergoes, because they're not necessarily inherently like negative. I mean, it's maybe not ideal, but it's not like actually a problem, and it's not what the manga is interested in challenging. So these traits, at least so far in the manga, haven't really been challenged or changed for Serpico. He hasn't had any sort of development in that regard. So we'll go through those 2 first, and then we'll attack the actual development, the actual arc that he has to go through. So the first of these character traits that we got to address is definitely the most noticeable one, which is his lack of empathy towards most people. He's very cold. He doesn't really care about anyone except for Farnese, including himself. And that's obviously because of that dependency that we talked about already. It's kind of both that the abuse has forced him into that sense of numbness, but also it's made him entirely dependent on Farnese. He can only really see her as somebody he cares for. One kind of obvious early example of this, where his lack of empathy is directly contrasted, would be when Mosgus is first introduced to him and Farnese, and Azan is also there, the kind of big, jollier kind of knight. And upon the torturers kind of coming out of the cart and being incredibly brutal, Serpico just like basically doesn't react. This isn't highlighted, it's not the focus is on Farnese's reaction, but in the background there's a contrast between Serpico and Azan, because Azan, as someone who hasn't gone through a lifetime of abuse, is horrified by what the torturers are doing, but Serpico basically doesn't react at all. There is one exception to the lack of empathy Serpico shows to basically everyone, and that's towards children. He's very sympathetic about children, he cares about children. That's shown a couple of times. When they're at the tower in Albion, for example, he stops. There's this kid being like harassed basically because his dad was being called a heretic, and then some of the knights are trying to make him confess to being a heretic. They're kind of like trying to force a confession so they can execute another person. And Serpico stops that from happening, and obviously that's very out of character for him, right? Like, he hasn't really shown that he cares for anyone he doesn't know. And I think the reason for this stems from the fact that he still remembers kind of having that level of empathy and of sympathy and being like a more emotionally expressive kind of being from when he was a child. And so he can see that kind of he can see himself in those children. He can't see himself in other adults because other adults kind of emotionally react to things and he doesn't. But what he can see is, because he knows that he would emotionally react to these things when he was a child, so he can kind of relate and empathize more with children. That might be bullshit because I'm not like a psychologist or anything, but that's definitely how I've seen his sympathy towards children throughout the manga. I don't know. I feel like that does make sense. So our second personality trait, kind of that we got to talk about here, that's a product of this abuse, would be what I've labeled as his formality. I don't know if that's the best word, but I couldn't think of a better one. And what I mean by that is that, I mean, it's kind of not too hard to work out. He's very formal. The way he talks is very matter of fact. He doesn't, use slang or anything really at all. And he moves kind of gracefully. He's all about being graceful. And I think the reason for that stems from the classism that we already talked about, because, even though he was in this aristocratic part of society, everyone knew that he was still like peasant born and looked down on him, with maybe the exception of Farnese. So in an effort to basically disguise that, I think he took on this almost excessive degree of formality, because if you look at how other people in the nobility, like a lot of the knights and even the members of the Vermilion family, if you look at how they act, they obviously don't act in the same way as like peasant characters necessarily, but they definitely do not act as formally as Serpico. So I think that his much more excessive amount of formality is basically a way of disguising the fact that he was born as a peasant, because he feels that, we already mentioned, that internalized classism, that internalized shame about himself. So naturally what he wants to do is distance himself from that, the fact that he's that class, which caused him the oppression in the first place. So instead he purposefully acts as sort of nobly, as formally as he possibly can, much beyond what any actual member of the nobility feels required to do, so that people don't assume that he's a peasant and then he has to endure further classism, which isn't part of the abuse he endured, right? And we can see this being challenged to like a more minor extent when he is just with Farnese and Guts and his party. Over time he does become a little bit less formal in the way he acts and moves, and even in the way he talks a little bit. And then we see, just for confirmation, that the moment they go into Vertanis and he's with Farnese in the Vermilion mansion, he's straight back to that formality. He kind of reverts back in the face of the oppression which forced that formality on him, and then he has to kind of loosen and shake that off again once they kind of leave Vertanis. So it's not like it's a whole character arc that's built off of this character trait, but we do see a more mild amount of challenging. I don't think that there's any need to kind of make him super less formal or informal before the end of the manga, and I don't think that's going to happen. I think that would be a bad idea, but they certainly have shown that it's not quite having the same hold on him that it was when he was growing up in servitude to Farnese and when he was in the Iron Chain Knights. And the third trait that's definitely notable about Serpico is how good he is in combat. He's a really good swordsman, and I think there's a good reason for that as well, that's similarly rooted in his childhood. So we know Serpico is super strong. He's one of the strongest human characters in the manga. He's probably not that far behind Guts, not in terms of strength, but on a ranking. If you were to rank all the humans by strength, he would definitely be very near the top. And obviously the main reason to have that is so there's someone else strong who can help fight alongside Guts in a lot of these more action heavy sequences. But I think it's also rooted in how Serpico views his own worth. So to Serpico, because he's a peasant, he's worth less than the nobility, and he has to prove that he's worth more, right? That's a part of the formality aspect as well. The reason he's so formal is to prove that he can be a part of the nobility. He's not actually just like a peasant. And the same thing is true of the combat, because it makes him useful, right? Being able to fight like that, to that extent, makes him useful. It's what allows him to be at the front of the chain knights, and that allows him to be respected. And obviously, he's being respected because all of those knights, other than him, you know, knights aren't born peasants. They're born into the nobility. All of those people are nobles. All those people were born with money and status and things. And they all look up to him because he's a better fighter than them, at least a little. And so that, I think, is kind of the reason that he is so good at combat, because he practiced to that extent so that he could hold the respect of the class that, before that, exclusively looked down on him. And obviously it's also there so that he can keep Farnese safe from all sorts of people, including herself. So we take those 3 traits and look at all of those. All of those traits, they're definitely formed from his abuse, but they're not necessarily, like, as I said, they're not really, like, super negative. I guess, like, the lack of empathy, for example, that's not exactly great, but for the most part, that's more in terms of expression of empathy and emotions rather than actually feeling them. I think he does feel them to some extent, so it's not necessarily, like, the worst. Obviously, it's not actually good to bottle that stuff up, but it's also not, like, it's not like the worst trait in the world, and it's not what what's being challenged here. The trait that's being challenged here is kind of what lies beneath all of these, and for me, I would say that is his lack of trust. He doesn't trust anyone. He doesn't even really trust Farnese. The only person he trusts to keep Farnese safe and to do anything really is himself. At the beginning of the manga, when he's introduced, the only thing that he trusts is himself. Unlike the kind of any of the other 3 traits, that's obviously not beneficial to him. That's not beneficial to anyone. It's not a trait that you want to kind of have in your personality. You want to be able to trust other people, and it also is informing all of the other 3 traits, right? Because if he's showing his emotions to people, that's him putting trust in them. And the same with being informal. If you're informal around somebody, that's you basically putting trust in them to have respect for you in spite of that lack of formality, I suppose. And of course, the combat, the reason he's so good at fighting is he doesn't trust other people to fight his own battles. That's kind of more symbolic in a way. So this trait is kind of going around, it's the key informant of everything, and it's the main product of his abuse, because everyone around him, his mother basically sold him off. His father manipulated him into a position of emotional abuse. He doesn't trust any of the people around him as a child, so why would he trust any of the people around him as an adult? And that's what the manga seeks to challenge. By challenging that trait, that's how you create Serpico's character arc, right? And the way that's challenged is because he has to learn to trust Guts and the other people in that group as they're traveling and doing all that stuff. And we see this happen quite a bit. I would say at this stage in the manga, Serpico is pretty far through that development. It's been very steady, it's been very consistent, and it's been very successful. And at this point, he has quite a lot of trust in the members of Guts' party, especially Guts himself. So the first time we see Serpico place trust in anyone other than himself, to an extent that's like noteworthy, I guess, would be when he accepts that he can't go and rescue Farnese from, I'm going to butcher this pronunciation, Kliphoff, the dimension that, the one that Slan's in. When Farnese and Casca get taken there, obviously he wants to go in and rescue her, but he's so severely injured he can't, and so instead of going in himself, he places his trust in Guts to go and rescue her. And the reason he trusts Guts in this moment is primarily because he knows Guts is extremely good at fighting, and that he obviously is going to go in there because he wants to rescue Casca. It's not exclusively because he actually has like full faith in Guts at this point, but it is a sign that he's starting to have trust in another person. it's like a start, right? That's where his arc officially takes the first step. So the second major place I would say where Serpico shows significant trust in Guts, and this is kind of a different one, but it's when he blocks the lightning bolt that Ganishka throws at Guts. So my reasoning behind this would be that if the lightning bolt hit Guts, he'd probably die. And Serpico, obviously, he doesn't like Guts, he wants to fight him, he wants him out of here. But I think in that moment he realizes that he actually does need Guts because that's someone he can actually trust in and rely on. So he jumps in to save him. I think that's a sign that he genuinely trusts him, more than the clip-off one where he's kind of forced into trusting him. Because he's completely able-bodied, he doesn't need to do this. This isn't something where he's like forced to do the blocking. He does it voluntarily, and that is him placing his trust in Guts in the long run, to continue to be on his side, basically. And obviously Guts is kind of going through the same exact idea, and this is also him learning to place his trust in Serpico. It kind of goes both ways in this moment. And then I think we get kind of official confirmation that Serpico has a lot of trust in Guts, and generally is more willing to trust new people as well, which is obviously significant because he'd been around Guts forever, so it's not as surprising that he's going to start to trust him. But what's a real sign of his development is that he also starts to trust people he's been introduced to more recently much faster, and the best example of this would be Roderick. So when Roderick is introduced, he's coming in as basically a suitor for Farnese, where they could potentially get married, and obviously if Roderick and Farnese get married, that kind of takes Serpico out the picture like a little bit. Like, he's no longer in that exclusive protection role of Farnese. He's no longer the person exclusively in charge of keeping Farnese safe from harm, because Roderick will also be doing that. And obviously that requires him to trust that Roderick will be able to keep Farnese safe. And initially I think he's kind of wary about this. He doesn't want to place that trust in him. But then when we're on Elf Island and there's all that, the big like party is happening, Roderick and Guts are off to like the side, and Serpico kind of, not necessarily word for word, but you know, in that conversation, Serpico basically says that he's placing his trust in Roderick and he's placing his trust in Guts pretty much for like the first time. I would say that's a genuine sign of his trust having grown, and almost it's kind of like he wouldn't necessarily need to be developed any further. I think there is a little further that he could be taken and maybe will be taken, but honestly that conversation, the arc could be completed right there. His character arc could be finished. He's gone from someone who trusts absolutely no one except himself to someone who trusts a good friend of his and is also willing to place trust in someone he doesn't know very well, and is basically overcoming the trauma that's a product of his abuse. I would say that that's character arc complete, you know, pretty much. And yeah, that's all I've got to say. That's the end of this. So what we've gone through there, Serpico was abused emotionally and physically as a child. That led to him being kind of emotionally apathetic and excessively formal and extremely combat prone, and all of that is underlined by a distrust in everyone around him, because why would he trust anyone when he's been emotionally abused? And what the main arc is, as I've just gone over, is that he goes from not being able to trust in anyone to being able to place trust in the people around him, and to place trust in people he doesn't know, which is, I say, more significant, because obviously if you're around someone for ages, you're probably going to trust them. And that's the character arc he goes through, and he's kind of gone through it. His character is kind of, it could be complete. It could be taken further, it could be complete. And I think it's a pretty successful character. It's not necessarily super complicated, it's more complicated than Isidro, but it's not like too much. And I think it's pretty good. So yeah, that's all I've got to say here. Yeah, hopefully you enjoyed that. Hopefully it was easy to follow. Hopefully the lack of me following the script really at all made that it was still manageable. The next one I'm going to do, I mentioned at the beginning, the next one I want to do is Shirka's character and look at her character arc, which I think is quite a sort of iffy one at times, but I do like it overall. I've already started writing that. I don't know how long it's going to take because I'm doing a ton of other things right now. I've got quite a busy summer, but it'll be done it'll be faster than this one because this is taking forever. But yeah, that's all I'm going to say. So yeah, bye.